My name is Casey Johnson. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm going to give you a little bit of my background before we jump into our topic today. I grew up in a little town called Stoughton. It's just south of Madison. I'm a Norwegian, so Stoughton fit me well. I got one other person that likes that I'm a Norwegian. That's great. But celebrate Setting Mai, and if you drive through Stoughton, like my aunt is one that did like rose malling all over the downtown of Stoughton area, so my roots are deep in Stoughton. I moved away when I was in my young 20s, as people often do when they grow up in a smaller town, and I went to Florida because it was supposed to become the next Hollywood, and I wanted to make movies, and that's what I was going to do for the rest of my life. So I moved down to Orlando. Then I lived there for a while. Then I lived in LA. My car was stolen. I couldn't afford to live there anymore. I moved back to Orlando. And when I moved back, I met Jesus. And it kind of changed the trajectory of what I was going to do. And I thought for a while I was going to kind of combine making movies with being a Christian. And then God called me into ministry. And it happened really fast. I was a Christian for maybe 9 months. And I started a young adult ministry in our church, which I would not recommend if you've only been a Christian for 9 months of your life to start a young adult ministry. I don't ever want to listen to any of the sermons I preached back then. But that's how I kind of got started in ministry. I started a young adult ministry because I saw a need within our church, and I saw all these young adults who were scattered and far from Christ, and I said, we need to disciple these young people. And so a guy who needed to be discipled himself, we started a ministry and discipled young adults. I went to seminary down at Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, and through that, I got a job in Daytona Beach where I helped this church become a church planting church. And they were much like you guys, where they were growing and they were kind of bursting at the seams, and rather than adding more services, they wanted to plant more churches in the Florida area. So I came on staff and we planted a church in Port Orange, Florida. And after that, we were looking for our next church planter, and I said, you know what? I said, I love helping churches get planted, but I really want to get my hands more dirty, so I became the next church planter. I had no idea that God was going to call us out of Central Florida and back home to the Madison area, and that's what happened. About 13 years ago, I planted Redeemer City Church in Madison, and it's still there, and it's still going strong. But part of my story and what I do now, but besides helping churches plant churches, is I really help leaders with productivity and health. And the reason why I do that is because I crashed and burned in ministry. I burned out. Our church was growing. We bought a building. We gutted this building. We built this building out. I took a sabbatical, much like Nick is on right now. And when I came back from the sabbatical, I hit a wall. And I couldn't explain it. I didn't know how to identify it. All I know is that I felt incredible shame and guilt that normal pastoral responsibilities were like pushing my head underwater. And it was the darkest season that my wife and myself have had as Christians. So I fought through that for like 2 years, just trying to get through and just pull to the other side. And when it came down to it, I sat down with Angela, my wife, and I said, I have to resign now, or I'm not going to be able to resign healthy. And so I resigned from the church, and I thought if I resigned now, I would be healthy. And then I realized in the next year to year and a half how unhealthy I actually was from just trying to push through and maintain my pastoral leadership. Long story short is that for years, when I talked to people and tried to discover what burned me out, everybody said it was the building project. Because there's a statistic that after a building project, 25% of pastors burn out in ministry. And then everybody said, and you had the building project from hell. You guys had to gut everything. We had to fire 2 general contractors. We had to do 2 capital campaigns within this. And for a short season, we had this gutted building that looked like a war zone, and we had no money to rebuild it. And so we got through that, and I kind of became a project manager along with many of my other pastoral responsibilities. And then I took my sabbatical, and it's when I came back from sabbatical that I realized how tired and worn out that I was. And so I used that excuse of the building for a couple years afterwards. And then my wife Angela and myself, we were having conversations, and we realized that when we talked about the building, that we talked about it with joy. I thought, man, that's the weirdest thing ever. Like, if this is something that almost took us out of pastoral ministry for the long haul, like this should give us like PTSD or something, and yet we're talking about it joyfully. So I spent this short season of like discovering and really diving into like what actually burned me out in ministry. And what I discovered is something that helps me help other pastors in ministry so they don't hit the same kind of wall that I hit. So not only am I working with Pastoral Nick with maybe some church planting stuff in the future, but we're also going to make sure that he is healthy and that he's spinning the right kind of plates and he's wearing the right kind of hats. And it's going to be a pleasure to walk alongside of him. So this morning, I thought, what could I kind of arrange this sermon to be that kind of hits some of the things that I'm going to be doing with your church. And I'll probably do church planning at another time, but I thought for this morning I would talk about work. And I know that some of you are probably sitting there and you're thinking, oh great, I just had a tough week getting through my job, and I just want to rest on the weekend and watch some NFL football this afternoon and maybe take a nap, and now I got to hear about work. If that's you here this morning, this sermon might be particularly for you. And I hope that it speaks to you of where you're at. Work is something we were designed to do, and it was something we were designed to take delight in. And yet, it's something that is really broken in our culture and our society today. I see for thousands of years, humanity has dropped the ball. Let's just say fumbled the ball, to use an NFL analogy, on what it looks like to work with our lives. I don't know a ton about Darlington yet, but in Madison, I'm surrounded by people who are weekend warriors. Do you know that term? It's like all these people that just kind of hate their jobs and they just try to make it through the weekend so that they can party on Friday night and then party on Saturday, and then Sunday comes and it should be a day of rest, but they got to party more because they're dreading going back to work on a Monday. I feel like every person I graduated high school with, like if you look at their Facebook profile, is just filled with weekend snapshots with beers in their hands. Because that's what they do. They hate their jobs. And they treat it like it's this necessary evil, and I have to work hard to be able to get the things that I want to get and do the things that I want to do, and it's this necessary evil, and I just have to do it. Work is broken. This morning, we're going to not only look at God's design for work, but we're going to look at ways that we missed the mark on our work, the way that God has designed it. Several ways that we do this, but the biggest way is by not working at all. Like if we're designed for work and we don't work at all, there's a big gap there, isn't there? This picture we find of a sluggard in the book of Psalms. And out of all the follies in the Psalms that it talks about, this one is the most ridiculous. It's a tragic comedy. It's nonsensical. It has often been called the epitome of folly. And the Proverbs uses descriptions like being hinged to a bed. I mean, think about that word imagery of just being hinged. What you do in your life is just toss back and forth on your bed. Or burying a hand into a dish but not having the energy to pull it back out to put the food to your mouth. That is a sluggard. Or making ridiculous excuses for not working. The word sluggard is only used in the book of Proverbs, but its meaning is used elsewhere in the Bible, using terms like sloth, or slack, or laziness, or idleness. But they all practically mean the same thing, and it's just to be lazy. The avoidance of work, or an unwillingness to work. Listen to this description in Proverbs 24, verses 30 through 34. I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, and a stone wall was broken down. Then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. This description used here in the Proverbs, it kind of reminds me of a vacant house. Like you're driving through your neighborhood and you see a vacant house, you can always tell, right? Like the lawn is overgrown, it needs to be mowed. All the landscaping is way overgrown. The house is dirty. The roof needs to be repaired. Maybe there's junk on the front porch, needs a new roof. But only this isn't talking about a vacant house. This is talking about the house of a sluggard. Somebody actually lives in this. And yet, this is the kind of destruction that follows it. The book of Proverbs teaches us about wisdom, and with the example of the sluggard, it teaches us if we want to be wise, we need to be a wise worker, and we cannot be a sluggard. So if a sluggard is a picture of what work is not supposed to be, what is work supposed to look like for us? If you open the Bible, how far in do you think you need to go before you find work? And not very far at all, right? Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created. In the beginning, like the very first word of the Bible, we see that our God works. I love that. I mean, it's just this great picture of who God is, and we were created in His image, and it's a good reflection of who we are as well. We have a God who works. The first verse in the Bible. And then the whole rest of the chapter talks about all the ways that God worked in creation, right? In the seventh day, He takes His rest. And then just in case we might miss God working here, and chapter 2 begins this way. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished His work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all His work that He had done in creation. It's repeated 3 times there, right? His work, God's work. Like, why draw this kind of attention to God? And I think it's fascinating, because when we distinguish Christianity from other religions, a lot of religions don't talk about work at all. In fact, some religions, they talk about work as if it's beneath their God and that He wouldn't work at all. But in Christianity, in the God of the Bible, we see right from the beginning of the pages that we have a God who works. It's who He is. The God of Christianity is a God who works, but it's not just work. We have a God who takes delight in His work. In Genesis 1:31, it says, "And God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good." So in other words, God worked, and then He looked back at His work, and He found that it was good. He took delight in it. As His image bearers, we do this often too, don't we? I'll give you a little example. If you mow your lawn, you mow your lawn, and when you're done, you don't just push your lawnmower into the garage and then walk into the house like a psycho, right? You go to the backyard. Isn't this what we do? Why do we do this? It's the weirdest thing ever. We go to the backyard and we stare at our backyard. And we nod our heads like, look at the work that I just did that maybe took you a half an hour if you have a small yard. But there's something that we take delight in, because we can see that progress. We see that yard and we see that it's mowed and it looks so good. It was probably long before and now it's just crisp. We want to walk around on it and we just look at it. We take delight in that work, because we have a God who works and He takes delight in His work too, right? The late pastor Tim Keller said, "In the beginning then God worked. Work was not a necessary evil that came into a picture later, or something human beings were created to do, but that was beneath the great God Himself. No, God worked for the sheer joy of it. Work could not have a more exalted inauguration." That's so good. We have a God who works, and we have a God who delights in His work, and guess what? We were created in God's image, and we were created to work, and we were created to take delight in our work as well. Genesis 2:15, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. Right from the very first page of the scripture, mankind is given a job to do. So here's one of the problems with work and how it's broken. When we look at work as a necessary evil or a product of sin and something that we have to do, and let's just grin and bear it and push through it, we just need to look back right here, because Adam is given a job, and this isn't a product of sin. He is in paradise. He is with God in paradise, in this perfect garden, and he is given a job. Paradise and work. Paradise and work. That's a hard thing for some people to grasp, isn't it? I wore this shirt today because it looks like a vacation shirt, and I thought, how great for this kind of topic to look like something that I should wear in Hawaii. But that's what we do. Sometimes we work our whole lives and we're thinking, when I'm done with it, I can just vacation, I can sit on the beach, and that's all I'm going to do. But guess what? We were designed for work, to take delight in our work. And unless we are living out of that design, we are going to be frustrated in our lives. We were made to work. And of course, the fall added thorns and thistles, but this doesn't change the fact that we were created in God's image to do work, and to delight in it. In Proverbs, the sage gives counsel to avoid the silliness of this folly of being a sluggard. And he says to be wise. And to be wise, we must be a wise worker. Here's our points for today. The wise worker is an ambitious worker, or a starter. The wise worker is a diligent worker, or a finisher. The wise worker is a strategic worker. In other words, they know how they're gifted and how they find joy in their work, how they can take delight in their work. And speaking of work, we need to get to work, because that was like a 11-minute introduction, and we're not even really getting into this. I was just seeing if anybody was going to run out when I said that. So we're all good. We're good. So let me start with the wise worker is an ambitious worker. Look at Proverbs 6 through 11. Verse 6, go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief officer or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. That last part repeated from the earlier Proverbs that we read. So the author here is using the ant as an illustration. And sometimes when we think of an ant, we think of it as being the strongest animal, right? The pound for pound, the ant is the strongest animal in the world. But it's not the strength of the ant that's talked about here. It's talking about the ant from being a self-starter. The ant is ambitious in their work. The ant doesn't need a foreman or a boss or a chief or a nagging spouse or a parent to get them out of the bed. The ant just gets to work, right? The ant is a self-starter. In contrast, they're using here, the sluggard just lies around and lacks the motivation to get to work. Look at the questions that are being asked of the sluggard. How long will you lie there? When will you arise from your sleep? And their response, just a little more sleep, just a little more rest. Let's just put off what needs to be done so that we can rest just a little bit longer. I have 4 kids at home. You can guess where I'm going with this. If anybody has children or can remember when you had children, this is like a repeated thing, like, come on, get out of bed. We need to go to school. Or we say things like, I have told you 3 times, I'm not going to tell you again. Yes, you will. You'll tell them again. But that's just what we say. So we have these our kids, we want them to get to work and have responsibility, but at the same time, as parents, we don't want them to be overburdened with responsibility, but yet we have them in our house for a short period of time. We don't want to send them off to college where they can be sluggards and be sluggards for the rest of their life, right? My younger brother, went to the University of Florida, and I went to visit him one time, and he lived with 5 other guys right on campus down in Gainesville, and I walked into his kitchen, and there was dishes piled high in the sink that had mold on them. How long do dishes have to sit in the sink in order to grow mold? I'm guessing not overnight, right? This is the picture that we do not want for our children, right? We don't want to show up when we send them out of the house and then see that they can't even clean up after themselves. We don't want them to be a sluggard. And it's easy to point elsewhere, but the finger doesn't have to wander to point back to ourselves, right? There are many days that I'd rather take a Saturday when I have a house project to do, say, guess what, I'm going to take my Sabbath a day early today. I'm going to get to that house project. I just want to rest or maybe watch some college football. Man, it's really tempting with college football on a Saturday, isn't it? I remember when we came out of COVID, I know being in Madison, we were in a different country than you guys were with dealing with COVID, so hopefully you guys were okay in this, but man, let me tell you what it was like to live in Madison during COVID. We didn't do anything. We stayed in our houses. If we went anywhere, we put on masks and tried to social distance by 6 feet. And, the things you saw on the news, it was absolutely ridiculous. And I thought the whole world was like it until I started driving around Wisconsin. And I'm like, oh, as soon as I got to Dane County, nobody's wearing masks anymore. How strange. Yes. But that's what we did. We developed these habits that often looked more like a sluggard than it did the ambitious worker during COVID. We played a lot of games. Sometimes we just hung around in our pajamas with our kids, and some of it was a lot of fun, and it was good bonding. But other things were a lot more like a sluggard. Let me give you an example. Does anybody else during COVID watch all of the Marvel movies in chronological order? Nobody else? Just me? All right, one other. Okay, a few hands. All right. I'm not alone. I guess that went outside of Dane County, and we're okay with that. Anybody else buy a big screen TV to watch those Marvel movies on? All right, one brave taker right there. Okay. So I'm not completely alone on that. But that's what we did. Like, how can we get comfortable in this time that we can't do anything else, which was fine for a season, but sometimes for a lot of people it was really hard to pull up out of that nosedive. It was really hard for us to be able to get back to work again. When it comes to hard work, there's a saying that rings true: we reap what we sow. In Proverbs 20, verse 4, the sluggard does not plow in the autumn. He will seek at harvest and have nothing. This is common sense, right? I mean, you guys have a farming community. I was sitting back there earlier, and I looked out through there, and all I see is fields. You have some farmers around here, right? I grew up in Stoughton. I grew up on a farm. My uncle was a farmer. I know farmland. And if you don't get out early in the spring and plow, you are not planting seeds in the spring, correct? If you don't plant seeds in the spring, you're not going to have a harvest in the fall, correct? If you don't have a harvest in the fall, you are not going to eat in the winter. We reap what we sow. And the sluggard doesn't plant the seeds in the spring, and then a surprise when they get to fall and they say, wow, I have nothing to eat. How did this happen? Starting a nonprofit has taught me one important lesson: is I reap what I sow. And if I'm really busy and good things are happening, I can look back to like 2 months ago and I can see all those seeds that I planted that now is time for a harvest. But then sometimes when my needle for fundraising for the nonprofit hasn't gone up, I can look back 2 months and I can see how I was busy with other things or took my foot off the gas pedal and stopped pursuing relationships to raise those kind of funds. We reap what we sow. The sluggard desires a harvest, but doesn't get a harvest because they slacked off and didn't plant the seeds when they should have. The sluggard reaps what they sow. And how did they get here? Verse 10, a little sleep, a little more rest, and then poverty comes like a robber and want like an armed man. This is how it happens. A nap here, a nap there, a bad habit here, a bad habit there, a day off here, a day off there, and then ding dong, poverty is your permanent house guest. French writer and humorist Jules Renard. I'm going to quote him twice right here because I think he's pretty funny, but I have no idea if I should be quoting him or not. He could be, I don't know who he is, but he's a funny man. About 125 years ago, he wrote, "Laziness is nothing more than the habit of resting before you are tired." I mean, that's a picture of a sluggard, right? Like, oh, I got some work to do today. I better rest and build up some energy for this work I'm going to do, rather than working and then resting afterwards. I got to say here, like, I don't want you to mishear me. Like, rest is really important, right? It's in our created design. We were designed to rest as well, but God has given us that order, like 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. That's when we take our Sabbath. We don't rest before we work. If you're stuck in this cycle, I'd say the best thing you can do is start some hardworking habits right now. You know, they say the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today. No matter what kind of hole you're in, if you can relate to this, the best time to start these new habits is today. Where do you want to be in a year? Where are you hoping to be in 5 years or 10 years? And what do you need to get there? Let's make a list and get to work. Recapture your created design for work. Plant those seeds today so that you might have a harvest in your own life soon. So the first thing we see in Proverbs is a wise worker is an ambitious worker, a starter. The second part is a diligent worker, which is more of a finisher of work. Proverbs 26, 13 through 16 says this. The sluggard says, "There is a lion in the road, there is a lion in the streets. As the door turns on its hinges, so does the sluggard on his bed. The sluggard buries his hand in the dish, it wears him out to bring it back to his mouth. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly." The sluggard puts his hand in the dish, but doesn't have the energy to put the food back in his mouth. This is why this is the epitome of folly. It's just nonsensical. Proverbs 12:27. Whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth. In this illustration, the sluggard finally musters the strength and ambition to be able to go out and hunt, and then he brings back his game and does nothing with it, and it rots. It's tragic. This is like raking a pile of leaves. And I hate to say this, but this day is coming soon, right? Raking a big pile of leaves in your backyard and then just taking some rest and coming back the next day to see that the wind has blown them all over the yard again. Where it's like planting a garden but failing to harvest and all the plants die. It's like going to the grocery store and buying some meat and sticking it in the fridge and not making a meal plan and then 5 days later throwing it in the trash. Jules Renard once again says, "Man who waits for roast duck to fly into mouth must wait very, very long time." The sluggard struggles to finish his work while the diligent worker earns precious wealth. If I was to be honest, this is the one I struggle with the most. Like, I have no problem starting things. I'm a starter. Like, I'm a church planner. Like, we start things, we build things, we make things, we create things. But I get really distracted by new things and have a hard time finishing and seeing things all the way through the end. And I get distracted by new shiny objects often. If you go to my house, like during COVID, we did a kitchen remodel like everybody else did. And COVID was a long time ago. That was 2020 we did this project. But you will look around and be like, oh yeah, you didn't finish the trim work there. I see you didn't fill the holes and caulk those and repaint the trim, and you didn't hang the doors up down the hallway. And I get to a point where it's livable, and I'm like, I want to go down to the next project. I have a really hard time finishing things and seeing them through to the very end. I know that's not the best example of being a sluggard. It's not like I'm just sitting around and doing nothing. I'm starting new projects. But yet, sometimes I struggle to push through the thorns and thistles of work. And if I'm not careful, before I know it, I'm hinged to my bed, and then ding dong, poverty is at the door. Am I alone in this one? Here's a potential solution. I'd like to say I made this up, but I'll give credit to my wife, and blame for my wife as well. But we created something in our house called Tenacity Saturday. And it's just as bad as it sounds. We take one project that we haven't finished in the house, and we take all day on a Saturday, and we finish that project, and I absolutely hate it. It's horrible. But let me tell you, like, how fulfilling it is when you have something that's hanging over your head, that's on a list that you know needs to get done, and you take a day, and you work with your spouse or work with somebody else, and be able to get it done, cross it off the list, and don't have to think about it again. There's a reason why the sluggard is not a finisher of work. There's a reason why God designed us to be able to not only start work, but to finish work, because we can take a lot of delight in crossing something off the list too, right? Are you a finisher? Are you waiting for roast duck to fly into your mouth? What is something you can do to motivate yourself to finish and to be a diligent worker? So a sluggard doesn't just fail to get started and finish the work. They use every excuse in the book of why things are not getting done. And the example here in Proverbs 26 is, there is a lion in the street. Now, I don't know about you, but if my job was to like sweep the sidewalk, and I walk outside and there's a lion on the curb, I'm probably taking the day off, right? But this isn't what the example is supposed to say here. It's nonsense. It's like saying, like us living in Wisconsin, if I can't go outside and do my work because there's a lion out there. Unless a lion escaped from the Vilas Zoo, it's a crazy, nonsense excuse for you not getting your work done. And that's the point. That's the point. Like, the sluggard makes silly excuses to why things are not getting done. But I think that's what we can do as well. It's really easy to put our blame on somebody else, to put our blame on the boss, on a coworker, or on a spouse, or on something that's not working, or distraction over here, instead of actually finishing the things that we need to do. The sluggard makes excuses. Are you waiting to get motivated? Is it someone else's fault? Is there a lion in the street? What is really keeping you from being a hard worker and being diligent and finishing the work that's in front of you? Finally, point number 3. A wise worker is not only an ambitious worker, a wise worker is not only what was my second point? Say it again. Diligent worker, thank you. A wise worker is also a strategic worker. And without taking away from being a diligent worker, it's important to understand how God has uniquely wired you and gifted you to work. And I know this is going to sound like a completely different language for most of us, because we're always just taught, like, it doesn't matter what you do, just get to work and get it done. Just be a hard worker. And there is some truth to that. But there's more to that as well. I would encourage you to be diligent in figuring out how God has uniquely wired and gifted you for work, especially since work is going to be about 1/3 of your entire life. In the example of the ants in Proverbs, yes, they're hardworking. Yes, they're ambitious. But not all ants are gatherers. They're not all the same. They're all wired and have different roles and responsibilities. A queen whose role is to make more ants, males or drones whose main job is to mate with the queen. Then there's defenders who fight off intruders and protect the queen and the nest. There's excavators who dig tunnels. There's gardeners who cultivate and remove trash from the nest. There's scouts who go out and find food and water and other nests and leave a trail for gatherers to follow. There's nurses who care for the young. And then finally, some are food gatherers. And these are the ants that we see most often, because these are the ones that are outside of the nest and actually doing that. If you ever see that across your sidewalk where you have just like this little trail of ants, that's the gatherers. But not everybody is a gatherer. Not all ants are wired that way. That's the ones we see, and that's the ones we picture when we think about ants. But they're wired and gifted in different kind of ways, and so are we. When God was building his people, all 12 tribes of Israel had different roles and responsibilities. Paul says that some plant and some water. Ephesians 4:11-12 says, "And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ." And there are multiple places through Scripture that talk about how we're uniquely wired and gifted and different from each other. And the end result of all of those things are for our common good, to build up the body, to serve one another, to equip the saints for ministry, for the glory of God. Understanding how you were wired and you were made and you were designed for work and ministry is important for all of those things. It's worth a little look inside to try to discover what that might be. In Acts 6, which is where I got the name for my nonprofit, it's called Axis 7. And it's kind of a tricky name. Axis was a working title for our nonprofit. And I kept saying Axis. And my wife, Angela, said, "Are you saying Axis or Acts 6? I'm saying Axis, but it's actually coming from Acts 6 is where I got the passage for why I'm starting this nonprofit. And the story in Acts 6 is the disciples are going out and they're ministering and the church is growing, and the disciples look at each other and they say, you know what, if we're going to preach and pray, we probably shouldn't be serving tables anymore. So they appoint 7 men to be able to serve these tables, and then they focus on preaching the word of God in prayer. And you know what the end result of that was? Just disciples saying, how have I been called? How have I been uniquely wired and gifted for ministry and for work? And they focus in on those kind of areas. The word increased, the number of disciples multiplied, and even some of the priests became believers. Even some of the priests, the Jewish priests, became believers. That doesn't happen without us focusing on the unique ways that God has wired and gifted us and using those gifts for God's glory. One of the things I have the pleasure of doing is to help pastors identify areas they're gifted in, as well as areas of frustration. And there's an assessment I use called the Working Genius. And it sounds way more clever than there really is, using the word genius in there. But it's saying that everybody is a genius in some kind of ways. There's a way that you've been wired and gifted in certain ways that you are going to be able to do better than other people. And more importantly, when you do these things, that you are going to find joy and energy and more fulfillment out of those kind of things than if you're not gifted for those kind of things. On the other end of that spectrum, it also identifies areas that you are frustrated in your work. And I know most assessments, there are personality profiles, and this one is like 10% personality profile and 90% work productivity tool. And what it does is it says, we're not going to work more on these things. The goal isn't to become better in our frustrations, it's to do those things less. And by doing those things less, it means we have more time to invest in the things where God has wired and gifted us and that bring us more joy and energy. And guess what happens when you're getting more joy and energy in your work? You enjoy doing your work, and you do more of it. Like burnout, when I looked at burnout, everybody thinks, burnout is because you work too much. And that's absolutely not true. I mean, you can overwork, that is for sure. But people that are doing the things that give them joy and energy in their life, they can work sun up to sundown, and they love it, and they get up the next day with joy in their hearts to be able to do the work that's in front of them. A good test for us is if you go to bed on a Sunday night and you are dreading getting up on a Monday morning, why is that? What are you dreading about your Monday morning? Or when you wake up on a Monday morning and you just have a hard time getting things going, and then you can't wait, like, Mondays. I would just tell you, if you're doing something you love, Sunday nights is a completely different experience. Because you're doing something that God has wired and designed you to do. I recently, one of the churches I'm working with in Madison, after service, I talked to this young man, and he said, here's my problem. I hate my job. I don't want to do my job. He was a mechanic, and he worked on big machinery, fixing things. And he said, I got promoted, and now I'm a supervisor, and I hate it. And I said, well, why don't you just go back to being a mechanic if you love being a mechanic so much? And he said, well, because I got a big promotion, and since then we bought a house and we had our third kid. I cannot go backwards financially to be able to do that. It's like, wow. So you're stuck doing a job that is draining you and you hate to do, and you don't get to do what you really like because of money. I recently had coffee with this pastor, and I asked about this guy, and I was expecting to hear like, yeah, he's not doing good, and he said he got a new job. He got a new job. He applied for other jobs, and he got a job that it doesn't pay as much, but it's 45 minutes closer to his house, so he's saving an hour and a half in the car every single day that he can invest in his young family. And the best thing is that he actually enjoys it, and he loves going to work, because the guy loves to work with his hands. He loves to fix things. He is not made to be a supervisor. And the same could be said for the opposite, right? Like maybe you're somebody who hates to work with your hands, but you love people, and you love to help people get organized, and you love to galvanize people to get to work and climb them out and do certain things. Like maybe a supervisor would be good for you. But we're wired differently. If you're struggling with being a sluggard, one of the best ways to overcome this is by identifying how God has uniquely made and wired you. If he has made you good at something that gives you life and energy, do that as much as you possibly can. I know there's going to be thorns and thistles in everything we do. It's just the way it is. That's what sin produced. We got to push through those things. But figure out how God has made you uniquely and use those things. Good for the world and good for yourself. All right, here's where I want to wrap up. I want to talk about our audience in this and then our motivation. 1 Corinthians 10:31, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Colossians 3:23 through 24, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as a reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. And one thing those two verses have in common is it says, whatever you do, no matter what it is, whatever you're doing, Do it with all your heart and do it for God's glory. And I love that Colossians mentions, like, do this for the Lord. This isn't something you're doing for your boss. This is something you're doing for the work. Work as a way that you are doing it for the Lord. And then here's our motivation. Before Jesus goes to the cross, back in John 17, which is often referred to as the high priestly prayer, Jesus prays to the Father, and he says, I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. I've read over that so many times, and it never really hit me like, he's accomplished the work that he gave him to do, but the big work that he came to do hasn't been done yet at all, has it? In the very next chapter, Jesus goes to the garden in anguish over the cup he's about to drink, and he asks the Father if there's any other way to accomplish this, like, take this cup from me. But not my will, but yours be done. This would have been the perfect opportunity for Jesus to run. This would have been the perfect opportunity for Jesus to hide. This would have been the perfect opportunity for Jesus to hinge himself to the bed rather than drinking the cup that was before him. But he doesn't run, does he? And he doesn't hide. And he doesn't hinge himself to the bed. And he accomplishes the work of salvation for us. Because of Jesus' love for the Father and his love for us, Jesus stayed and completed his work. Jesus went to the cross for us. Jesus takes on the wrath of God towards sin and evil, and he pays the penalty with his perfect sacrifice. Jesus accomplishes salvation for all who might believe, even when it was difficult. Jesus pushed through and finished his work for God's glory and our good. And likewise, with the example of Jesus, each one of us has been designed and wired for work. And despite the thorns and thistles, our very design is to work, and to work with all of our hearts, and to work for the glory of God, and to work in a way that shines light on the gospel of Jesus so that others might glorify God as well. Let's figure out how to take delight in our work. Amen?